A few years ago, I did a study on how to improve recycling. I'm going to tell you about it. Here was the setup. Undergraduate students in Singapore came to my research lab, and upon entry, one at a time, they received a small clear plastic tasting cup with a small sample of a yogurt beverage in it. They were told that we were interested in how the label of the bottle affected their perceptions. They were sent into a tasting booth which contained a sink, a rubbish bin, and a recycling bin. They were told to drink the yogurt sample, fill out a survey, and then dispose of a cup. And there were some different conditions. In one condition, the recycling bin and rubbish bin were located right next to each other and also right next to the sink. And what we found was that roughly 1/3 of the plastic tasting cups ended up in the recycling bin, and 2/3 ended up in the rubbish bin. So the recycling rate was relatively low. But we did something quite simple for some of the participants. We moved the rubbish bin over near the entrance of the tasting booth. They saw it on the way in, but it wasn't right next to them where they were tasting the yogurt. In that case, 95% of the plastic tasting cups ended up in the recycling bin. So the recycling rate increased from around 30% to around 95%. This is an example of what's called a nudge. By placing the recycling bin at the point of behavior, it somewhat implied that that was the correct behavior. It also made it the more convenient behavior to perform. Whatever reason, the recycling rate increased dramatically. But that wasn't the only thing I was interested in. I was also interested in the contamination level. In Singapore, somewhere around 50% of recyclables can't be recycled because they're contaminated with things like food waste and other residues. And that's why I gave the participants in this study a yogurt drink to fill the cup, because it would potentially contaminate it. Let me tell you about how I evaluated the different contamination levels. So I sent this photo series to one of the waste managing companies in Singapore, and I said, which of these, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, would you recycle if you received a plastic item with this level of contamination? And they said they would accept only 1. 2 was already too much contamination. So plastics in Singapore have to be essentially spotless in order to be recycled, and this just shows the extent of the contamination problem. So what I did is when I took the tasting cups out of the recycling bin or the rubbish bin, I was able to evaluate them and say, okay, what's the contamination level? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Using that system to grade the contamination level, I found that without any additional information in this setup, the contamination level was 3.7 on that scale I showed before. So very high contamination level on average. But then I added a poster. And I tried some different posters, but this was the most effective, so I'll tell you about this one. And I presented the simple idea that recyclables need to be virtually spotless. How clean must recyclables be? The 5 and the 3 are both no. Actually, that was probably the 5 and the 2. Even a little bit of contamination is problematic. Only the 1 level of contamination is acceptable. And by communicating that simple fact, the contamination level decreased to 3. Now, this is still far too high, but it was a significant reduction in contamination. And so what this study showed is that you can create these nudges, and these are things that businesses can do, that universities can do, that organizations can do, to make recycling the easier or more obvious choice. I can sure imagine situations, and you might also imagine, when you have a recyclable and you want to recycle it, but there aren't any recycling bins, so you end up just throwing it in a rubbish bin. That's an example of a great opportunity to install more recycling bins and create these nudges where people who have a recyclable will then make that correct choice. But that's not the entire story, because it doesn't address the contamination level. And so it shows another opportunity to use communication interventions. These are things that organizations can do, like universities, like businesses, to help people recycle more correctly or more appropriately. I'm going to give you one example of a successful recycling program at the National University of Singapore. I know the person who is deploying all these sustainability initiatives at NUS, and this was one of his early great ideas on how to get people not only to recycle, but to recycle correctly. One issue with recycling is that items that can't be recycled end up in the bins. And so he came up with this great idea where for notes in cardboard or rinsed cans or rinsed bottles, notice they use the word, these bins use the word rinse to emphasize that they need to be clean. But then there were examples in a little display case in the top. And through displaying what can be recycled, there was a huge increase, or I should say a huge decrease in improper materials being placed in the recycling bins. So here's another example, a real world example of how organizations can shift the behaviors of the public just with these subtle nudges, right? By having these different bins, it creates a bit of a nudge. But there's the informational nudge as well, where there's communication about what can be recycled, and that's impactful. And so it's initiatives like this that can contribute to a circular economy. Thanks for watching.